What are the neural mechanisms that underlie orientation-dependent after effects under crowding? So we were talking about this relationship between B1 and the consciousness, and then the next, I'm going to talk about this in experimental data part in a more detail. So let's decompose orientation-dependent after effects under crowding, because this is quite a complicated phenomenon. First of all, what are the neural mechanisms for one, adaptation or after effects, and then two, orientation processing, and then three, crowding. Okay, this is actually necessary to understand why it's something to do with the B1 and its MCC. First of all, adaptation. Okay, so if you take a look at this figure and then fixate at this central point of the cross, unlike after effects stuff that I showed in the last video, it's probably very easy to see after effects. So here, if I change into white background, you start to probably see pink, green, blue, and yellow, and now it's faded. And then again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pink, green, blue, yellow. Pink, blue, pink, green, blue, yellow. So this is called after image. It's the most easy kind of demonstration of the after effects or adaptation. And the model is that after the adaptation, some particular class of neurons become kind of weaker, fatigued, and then response becomes weaker. And then in terms of the balance of the response across many different kind of neurons, it elicits this kind of adaptation phenomenology. So in the case of the color, if the color experience is generated by the balance between the red and the green here and here at each location, then adapting the green makes the response to the green neurons lower and the relatively red one becomes higher. And therefore, here you see red, and the same goes here. Red neurons become weaker, and then green neurons relatively become stronger. And then yellow and blue also has an opponent kind of process. So after adapting the yellow, you see blue, and after adapting the blue, you see yellow. And that's what you see here, okay? So color after effect seems like really vivid and also super interesting kind of phenomenon to use. But the problem is that adaptation can be happening throughout the visual system. And in fact, at the level of the retina, the cones that respond to green starts also adaptation. And LGN also inherits that kind of adaptation. And then B1 and so on, all the way along the visual areas show this adaptation, color after effect. And what it means is that we can't isolate any kind of process that is happening only in the B1, right? So color after effects, unfortunately, cannot be used for as a test to study whether B1 is related to consciousness or not. All right, then the next topic, what's happening in the brain in terms of the orientation processing. So the simple model is that the neurons in the retina and LGN has always almost like on-center versus off-center response. On the other hand, the V1 neuron starts to respond to oriented lines. And so this is a recap of this the retinal ganglion cell response. When there is a spot, that particular neuron actually prefers in terms of the receptive field. And then there's a crazy, huge response. But if it's annulus, then it gets inhibited. And the off-center cell shows the opposite kind of polarity. But the point here is that at the level of the retina and the LGN, most of the neurons respond to the spot in the visual areas, okay? Visual field. On the other hand, as you go into the B1, then it starts to respond to a line like here. And then when my B1 neurons have a receptive field around here, depending on whether I show it here, vertical or horizontal or oriented and so on, and also direction of motion, it changes the response magnitude. So here is one particular neuron that responds to a particular area of the visual field, and then it likes this oriented line, 45-degree oriented line, especially when it goes into this direction, to the top right, but not to the other direction. And this is the famous finding by Huber and Wiesel that led to the Nobel Prize in 1965 or 7 or something like that. Okay. So what it means is that some kind of a hierarchical processing that goes from retina to LGN and then arriving at V1. Finally, this kind of line response starts to emerge, and that's likely to be coming from the convergent input from the LGN. As I said, as the hierarchy goes up, the later neurons tend to receive multiple inputs from the lower areas. And the LGN, the neurons that respond to the dots and spots that is located like this way, can form the stronger input and the receptor field property of the V1 neuron that prefers this diagonal line. That's the idea. So the higher in the hierarchy a neuron locates, the bigger the receptor field size becomes, and also more complicated the tuning property of the receptor field. So like spot into light, and then eventually to the face, and also concepts and things like that. That's the idea. And it's also important to talk about the columnar structure in V1. So within V1, especially at the input layer 4, then there is a cluster of the neuron that prefers input from left eye or right eye and left eye, right eye, left eye, right eye. It's not colored in this way, but you can color it based on some kind of computational processing. And also, it's important to say that within the V1, along the vertical dimension across layers, when one particular neuron prefers particular orientation, such as this, horizontal or vertical, then all the neurons along this, vertical dimension seems to prefer similar orientation. That's called columnar structure in V1. Okay. And also important is to just recap that in terms of the size of the brain, receptor field, retina, LGN, and then B1 starts to receive more, wider input related to the particular spot receptor field of the retina and the LGN, right? And that result in this, crowding phenomenon. Okay. So what I mean is that RF gets bigger and bigger as you go up in the visual hierarchy, and the V1 is still very, very small. So this is, for example, one hypothetical kind of photographs and that you're looking at, and how your V1 neurons and so on would have a receptor field. So if you are fixating here at the center, and then V1 neuron size could be this size. Depending on the distance from the photo, it may or may not be realistic. But B2 neurons have a bigger receptive field size, meaning that it collects many neurons in B1's output. And the same goes for the next layer, like B4. B4 collects a lot of neurons output from B2. And then IT also becomes even bigger. So that seems to already suggest that at the higher level of the visual areas, when the things are presented like, there are many faces here and so on. So as long as you are fixating at this central location, it starts to get crowded by many areas of the many inputs. And that's the source of the crowding. Okay. And so if the higher brain areas are responsible for consciousness, then it seems to be making sense that the crowding happens, and crowding generates this invisibility if it hinders the processing at the higher level. And then finally, it's just about the model, but orientation dependent adaptation wise. what's happening in the brain. So the simple model is that after adaptation, some neurons response becomes weaker. So let's say if you show that neuron that responds to this particular orientation, and the y-axis here is a response. Okay, so when the neuron was shown with a particular oriented line like this, it fires like 50 times second. But if it's not, then its response gets weaker and weaker. And then if it's after 90 degree to the, here or here, then it starts not to respond very well. And then after adaptation to this 0 degree, line, then what happens is that this particular neuron's response starts to become very weak compared to this situation. Only at this 0 degree point. Okay, so now this neuron can still respond to the right side here, but it becomes its response even to the preferred 45 degree becomes also weaker. And then 0 degrees response becomes almost like, from modest into almost nothing. And then if there are lots of neurons like this, prepared for different orientations, and then after the adaptation, it starts to become like this type of the population response, then you can imagine that we would need stronger stimulus to respond. And that's one potential model of the orientation-dependent adaptation and its phenomenology. Okay. So in sum, what I said in this video is that the adaptation after effects happens after prolonged exposure to a particular stimulus. And the orientation-dependent after effects are likely to emerge after V1. The reason is that orientation process itself starts to emerge after V1, not before. And then the crowding also makes a stimulus invisible, but given the size of the receptor field, V1 is unlikely to be responsible for the crowding-induced invisibility. As long as you tailor the stimulus property, it can be targeted that crowding is not happening at the level of the V1, but a higher level. And then the logic starts to come together, right? I don't say explicitly right now, but can we now explain if orientation dependent after effects and the crowding tells us conclusion about V1 and the consciousness? And then let's consider that in the next video.